I've always loved Sundays. The smell of cornbread baking in the oven, the house with white curtains dancing in the breeze, and the wall clock marking time with peaceful rhythm. But ever since my granddaughter Clara moved in here with that husband of hers, some self-important businessman type named David, everything became quietly hostile, like a slow poison seeping through the walls of my sanctuary. They came saying they would help me, take care of me. "Grandma, you shouldn't be living alone at your age," Clara had said, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like condescension. "What if something happens? What if you fall? What if you forget to turn off the stove?" The questions came like tiny arrows, each one designed to make me doubt my own competence, my own right to exist independently in the space I had called home for 43 years. But little by little, things started disappearing. My favorite armchair, the one where I'd nursed my babies, where I'd held my husband's hand during his final days, was suddenly donated to charity because it was taking up too much space. The old radio that had been my companion through countless lonely evenings was thrown away because it was just clutter and didn't even work properly. Dios. Never mind that it worked perfectly fine for me, that I knew exactly how to adjust the antenna to catch my favorite classical music station, that its familiar static and warm tubes were like the breathing of an old friend. My plants, carefully cultivated over decades, were suddenly reorganized into different spots where they couldn't possibly thrive. The African violets that had bloomed faithfully for 15 years were moved away from their perfect east-facing window to a dark corner because Clara thought they looked better there. When I protested, she smiled that patronizing smile and said, "Trust me, Grandma. I know about decorating." The house that had been mine for 43 years was slowly being erased, transformed into something sterile and modern that felt nothing like home. Clara would rearrange my kitchen without asking, claiming she was organizing things better. She moved the coffee cups to a cabinet I could barely reach, rearranged my spice rack according to some system that made no sense to me, and threw away expired items without checking if they were things I still used and found perfectly fine. She would throw away my old magazines before I finished reading them, saying they were cluttering the space. Never mind that I liked to read slowly, to savor articles, to sometimes return to pieces that had particularly moved me. Everything had to be efficient, modern, optimized according to her standards of how an old woman should live. Every small change felt like a tiny death, a piece of my life being deemed unnecessary, outdated, wrong. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own house, watching helplessly as my lifetime of choices and preferences were dismissed as the confused wanderings of a mind that could no longer be trusted. I remember the day she packed away my wedding china, the delicate blue and white set that had belonged to my mother before me and her mother before that. 4 generations of women had used those plates for special occasions, had passed down stories while washing them carefully by hand, had treasured them as symbols of continuity and family history. "Grandma, this old stuff is just collecting dust," Clara said, wrapping each plate in newspaper like it was garbage instead of memory. "Besides, it's not really practical for everyday use, is it? What if one breaks? They don't even make this pattern anymore." I watched from the doorway, feeling smaller with each piece that disappeared into the cardboard box. "But those are for special occasions," I whispered. "What special occasions?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a practicality that cut through my heart. "When do you ever have company anymore? When do you ever entertain? It's just you here, Grandma. You don't need fancy china gathering dust in a cabinet." She wasn't wrong about the facts. I didn't entertain much anymore. Most of my friends had passed away or moved to assisted living facilities. My children lived far away and visited infrequently. But she was wrong about everything else. Those plates weren't about practicality or current social needs. They were about continuity, about maintaining connection to the women who had come before me, about preserving the possibility that someday, somehow, there might be another special occasion worth celebrating. The mornings became the worst part. I'd wake up in my own bedroom and feel like a stranger in my own house. The coffee maker, a simple percolator that had served me faithfully for 20 years, had been replaced with some complicated machine that Clara's husband insisted made better coffee. It had buttons and timers and settings that confused me, and when I asked for help, David would sigh impatiently and explain it in the tone people use with children or the mentally impaired. "It's really quite simple, Helen," he'd say, never calling me Grandma like Clara did, always using my first name in a way that felt deliberately distancing. "You just press this button here, select your strength here, and wait for the beep. See? Much better than that old thing you had." But I didn't want better coffee. I wanted my coffee, made the way I'd been making it for decades, with the ritual and rhythm that had started my mornings for longer than David had been alive. I wanted the familiar sound of the percolator bubbling, the simple routine of measuring grounds and water, the meditation of waiting without buttons or beeps or digital displays, the simple wooden table where I'd eaten breakfast for decades, where I'd helped my children with homework, where I'd paid bills and written letters and planned gardens, was suddenly covered with a modern tablecloth that felt cold and synthetic under my fingers. When I asked about my old cloth, the one with tiny flowers that I'd embroidered myself as a young bride, Clara said it had been too stained and looked dated. Even my daily routines were being quietly corrected, as if everything I'd done for years was somehow wrong, inefficient, dangerous, or inappropriate for someone my age. The way I arranged my medications, the path I took through my garden, the time I preferred to eat meals, the television programs I enjoyed, everything was subject to Clara's gentle but relentless improvement. "Grandma, you really shouldn't be taking those stairs so often," she'd say when I went upstairs to my sewing room. "Why don't you set up your sewing machine down here in the living room? It would be so much safer." But I didn't want to sew in the living room. I had set up my sewing room 30 years ago in the small upstairs bedroom that caught the morning light perfectly. It was my sanctuary, my creative space, organized exactly as I liked it, with threads and patterns and tools accumulated over a lifetime of making things with my own hands. Moving it downstairs wouldn't just be about safety. It would be about surrendering another piece of my independence, another acknowledgement that my preferences mattered less than their concerns. Clara would smile sweetly while she made these suggestions, always with some reasonable explanation. "This will be easier for you, Grandma. This is more practical. You'll love this once you get used to it." But I never did get used to it. How could I get used to disappearing in my own home? Her husband was worse in his own way. David never said much directly, but I could see the calculation in his eyes when he looked around the house. He'd measure walls with his gaze, comment on the potential of certain rooms, talk about maximizing space, like my life was just inefficient use of square footage. Sometimes I'd catch him on the phone in hushed conversations about property values and renovation opportunities and market conditions. He'd walk through my house like he was already planning its future without me in it. I'd see him looking at my bedroom and wondering if it would make a better office. I'd catch him measuring my sewing room with his eyes, probably calculating how it could be converted into something more useful than an old woman's hobby space. "This house has such good bones," he'd say to Clara when he didn't think I was listening. "The location is perfect, and with some updates, It could be worth twice what she paid for it. Of course, it needs work. The kitchen is completely outdated, the bathrooms need gutting, and all this old furniture would have to go. He spoke about my home like it was a fixer-upper project, not a place where someone had lived and loved and built a life. He saw square footage and market potential where I saw memories and meaning. To him, my house was just an asset to be optimized. To me, it was the repository of everything I'd been and done and cared about. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in spring. I'd been tending to my small garden, the one patch of earth that still felt entirely mine, when I came inside to find Clara rearranging my living room again. This time she'd moved my mother's rocking chair, the one where I'd nursed my children, where I'd sat during countless sleepless nights when they were sick, where I'd found comfort during my husband's final illness and the long grief that followed. The chair was more than furniture. It was a time machine, a place where I could feel connected to my younger self, to my mother, to all the women who had found solace in its gentle motion. It had been my refuge during the darkest periods of my life, the place where I'd made difficult decisions and found the strength to carry on. Clara, honey, please put that back where it was, I said, trying to keep my voice gentle, trying not to sound like the querulous old woman I was afraid of becoming. She looked up at me with that patronizing smile that had become so familiar, the one that said she knew better than I did about everything, including my own life. Oh, Grandma, it looks so much better over here. Trust me. I have an eye for these things, but I like it by the window. That's where it's always been. That's where the light is good for reading. That's exactly the problem, she said, continuing to push the heavy chair across the floor with David's help. Just because something's always been a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way. This room needs better flow, better balance. You'll see. It's going to look so much more modern. Modern. Everything had to be modern, as if the accumulated wisdom of decades was somehow inferior to whatever trend happened to be popular at the moment. As if the carefully considered choices I'd made over a lifetime of living in this house were just random mistakes waiting to be corrected by someone younger and presumably smarter. I felt something crack inside my chest, but I said nothing. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the walls that no longer felt like mine. That's when I realized what was happening, what had been happening so gradually that I'd almost failed to notice it. This wasn't about helping me or taking care of me. This was about waiting for me to become so small, so invisible, so compliant that I'd eventually just disappear entirely. The thought terrified me more than any illness or injury ever had. I'd survived my husband's death after 45 years of marriage, raised 3 children mostly alone after he passed when they were still teenagers, worked 2 jobs to keep this house when the insurance money ran out, weathered every storm life had thrown at me. I'd battled through my own cancer diagnosis, nursed my elderly parents through their final years, buried friends and siblings, and survived the kind of losses that would have broken a weaker person. But somehow I was being defeated by kindness, or what masqueraded as kindness. I was being killed by concern, erased by care, eliminated by people who claimed to love me but seemed incapable of respecting me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house in the darkness, touching the walls, remembering when my husband and I had painted each room ourselves, saving money by doing the work together over long weekends while the children played in the yard. I remembered when we'd chosen the wallpaper for the dining room, arguing good-naturedly about patterns until we found one we both loved. I remembered when the children had taken their first steps on these floors, when grandchildren had visited and filled these rooms with laughter and chaos and the beautiful noise of family life. Every corner held a story. Every piece of furniture had been chosen with love and saved for with sacrifice. The coffee table had been my husband's first attempt at woodworking, imperfect but precious. The bookshelf in the den held not just books, but the complete record of my family's reading life. Children's books worn soft from bedtime stories, cookbooks stained with decades of use, novels that had carried me through long winter nights. The house wasn't just shelter, it was the physical manifestation of my life, the three-dimensional autobiography of a woman who had loved and worked and chosen and built something meaningful. Every room was a chapter, every object a sentence in the story of who I had been and who I still was. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would have a conversation with Clara. I would explain how I felt, ask her to slow down, to include me in decisions about my own home and my own life. I would try to make her understand that help didn't have to mean erasure, that care didn't require the elimination of the person being cared for. I rehearsed the words in my mind, trying to find the right balance between firmness and understanding. I practiced expressing my feelings without sounding ungrateful, setting boundaries without seeming hostile. I wanted to preserve our relationship while reclaiming my autonomy, to accept assistance while maintaining authority over my own existence. But Clara spoke first. On the morning when everything changed, Clara appeared in the living room with a cold expression that I'd never seen before. She had the look of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to implement it regardless of opposition. I watched her from my spot on the couch, my coffee cup trembling slightly in my hands as I sensed the approaching storm. "Grandma, we need to talk." The words hit me like ice water. In my experience, conversations that began with "we need to talk" never ended well. I felt it in my chest that this wasn't going to be good, that whatever came next would change everything between us. She sat down across from me, but not in a way that suggested conversation or mutual decision-making. She sat like someone about to deliver a verdict, like a judge preparing to announce a sentence. Her posture was rigid, her expression set, and I could see that she had rehearsed this moment, planned it out, prepared for my possible responses. "This house, it's not from your time anymore. You don't belong in this place anymore." I choked on my coffee, the hot liquid burning my throat as the words penetrated my consciousness. It wasn't just about the house, it was about me, about being inconvenient, about being too alive, too present, too insistent on existing where they expected silence and compliance. The words hit me like a physical blow, not just the meaning but the casual cruelty of it. After months of small erasures, gradual diminishments, and subtle undermining, here was the final statement. I didn't belong in my own home, in my own life. According to my own granddaughter, I had become obsolete, a relic taking up space that could be better used by people who mattered more. "Clara," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heart breaking. "This is my house." "Legally, yes," she said, as if she'd prepared for this response, as if she'd anticipated my confusion and had ready answers for every possible objection. "But practically? Grandma, look around. You can't maintain this place anymore. You can't keep up with modern life. The house is too big, too old, too much work for someone your age. It would be better for everyone if you moved somewhere more. Appropriate. Somewhere with people your own age, where you'd be more comfortable and better cared for. People my own age, as if I were some artifact to be stored away with other relics, catalogued and contained where I couldn't disturb the lives of people who still mattered, who still had futures worth considering. "I am comfortable," I said, my voice growing stronger as anger began to burn through the shock and hurt. "I'm comfortable here, in my home, In the place I've lived for over 40 years, where I raised my children and cared for my husband and built my life. Clara sighed, the sound sharp with impatience and barely contained frustration. But we're not comfortable, Grandma. David and I, we have plans. We have a life to build, a future to create. And frankly, this house is wasted on just one person, especially someone who... She trailed off, but I knew exactly what she meant to say. Someone who wouldn't be around much longer. Someone whose remaining time didn't justify the space she was occupying. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of love that was suddenly revealed to be conditional, temporary, disposable. All the birthday parties I'd thrown for her, all the bedtime stories I'd read, all the cookies I'd baked and presents I'd saved for and encouragement I'd offered, all of it apparently counted for nothing against her desire for my house and her impatience with my continued existence. You mean, I said slowly, the words forming themselves as I spoke, that you want me to move out of my own house so that you can live in it? It's not that simple, Clara said, but her eyes couldn't quite meet mine. We're thinking of everyone. You'd be safer in a facility designed for seniors. You'd have professional care, activities with people your own age, medical support if you need it. And David and I could take care of the house, maintain it properly, make sure it doesn't fall into disrepair. Professional care, activities with people my own age, medical support. She made it sound like a vacation resort instead of what it actually was. A place where people went to wait for death, where individuality was sacrificed for efficiency, where the last shreds of independence were traded for the illusion of safety. And what if I don't want professional care? I asked. What if I want to live in my own house, with my own things, making my own choices about my own life? David appeared from the kitchen then, probably having heard the conversation and decided it was time for him to provide backup for his wife's ambush. His expression was patient but firm, the look of a businessman accustomed to dealing with unreasonable people who didn't understand their own best interests. Helen, he said, using my first name like a weapon, you have to be realistic about your situation. You're 82 years old. You have some health issues. This house is expensive to maintain, and it's only going to get more expensive as things break down and need replacement. Do you really want to spend your final years worrying about plumbing and roof repairs and property taxes? Final years. As if my remaining time was just a problem to be managed, a burden to be minimized, an inconvenience to be resolved as efficiently as possible. Maybe I do, I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. Maybe I want to spend my remaining years in my own home, making my own decisions, living my own life instead of the life other people think would be more appropriate for someone my age. Clara leaned forward, her voice taking on that coaxing tone that adults use with stubborn children. Grandma, be reasonable. You fell last month and couldn't get up for 20 minutes. What if it had been worse? What if you'd broken something? What if no one had found you? She was right about the fall. I had slipped on a wet patch in the bathroom and had trouble getting back to my feet. It had scared me, I'll admit. For 20 long minutes I'd lain on the cold tile, wondering if this was how it would end, alone and helpless on my bathroom floor. But I had gotten up. I had been fine. I had cleaned up the water and bought a bath mat and been more careful, the way any sensible person would. But nothing worse happened, I said. I got up, I was fine, and I learned to be more careful. People fall at any age, Clara. Living involves risks. Being alive involves the possibility of getting hurt. But why take unnecessary risks? David interjected. Why live with constant worry when there are alternatives designed specifically for your needs, my needs, as if they had any understanding of what my actual needs were? As if my need for independence, for dignity, for continuity with my own history somehow mattered less than their need for convenience and their vision of my future. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate care. I looked around the room, at the walls where my children's school photos still hung, at the mantelpiece where my wedding picture sat beside Clara's graduation photo, at the worn carpet where 3 generations had played and laughed and lived and loved. Each wall held history. Each piece of furniture carried my touch, my choice, my life. The scratches on the coffee table were from my children's art projects. The worn spot on the sofa was where my husband had sat every evening to read his newspaper. The plants on the windowsill were descendants of cuttings my mother had given me when I was a young bride. And there she was, my granddaughter, trying to erase me like someone switching off an old lamp that no longer gave enough light, no longer served the purposes of people with more important things to do. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady and clear, filled with a certainty that surprised me. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This conversation is necessary, but not for the reasons you think." I walked to the kitchen drawer, the one that stuck a little and required just the right touch to open, a touch I'd perfected over decades of daily use. I pulled out the ring of keys, the ones that fit every lock in this house, the ones that only I knew the exact sound they made when turned correctly, the ones that represented 43 years of mortgage payments and maintenance and care. I walked back to the living room where Clara sat, probably expecting tears or begging or some kind of grateful surrender to her superior wisdom and planning. Instead, I turned to face her and said, my voice steady and unwavering, "If I don't belong in this place anymore, then neither do you." And I extended my hand, firm and decisive. "Get out of my house." She sat there speechless, as if the words hadn't quite reached her brain yet, as if the possibility that I might have my own opinion about my own life had never occurred to her. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping for water. Then David stepped forward, his face reddening with indignation, his businessman's composure cracking as he realized that this negotiation wasn't going according to his plan. "Now, let's all just calm down and discuss this rationally." "No," I said, turning to face him with a firmness I hadn't felt in months. "There's nothing to discuss. There's nothing rational about trying to convince someone to give up their home, their independence, and their dignity for your convenience. The deed is in my name. The utility bills are in my name. The mortgage was paid off with my husband's life insurance and my own sweat and sacrifice. This house is mine. It always has been." Clara finally found her voice, but it came out as a whine, the petulant sound of someone accustomed to getting her way through manipulation and emotional blackmail. "Grandma, you're being unreasonable. We were just trying to help." "Help?" I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of someone who had finally seen through the pretty lies and gentle cruelties. "You were trying to help me disappear. You were trying to help me become so small and quiet that I wouldn't inconvenience you anymore. You were trying to help me out of my own life so you could have my house without the bother of my continued existence." She started crying then, those manipulative tears that had worked on me so many times before, the ones designed to make me feel guilty for not appreciating her concern, for not being grateful for her attention, for not surrendering gracefully to her vision of my future. "It's not like that. We love you. We want what's best for you. We're worried about you living alone, about what might happen." "What's best for me?" I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide, letting in the spring air and the sound of birds and the scent of my own garden, "is to be treated with respect in my own home. What's best for me is to have my choices honored and my opinions valued. What's best for me is to not be erased by people who claim to love me, but seem incapable of seeing me as a person with rights and preferences. and the capacity to make decisions about my own life. David stepped forward, his face now dark with anger, his mask of concern completely dropped. You can't just kick us out. We have rights. We gave up our apartment to move in here. We've invested time and money in this place. You can't just change your mind because you're having some kind of senior moment. Senior moment. As if standing up for myself, asserting my right to exist in my own space, was evidence of mental decline rather than mental clarity. What rights? I asked, shaking the keys so they made that familiar musical sound that had welcomed me home for 43 years. The right to live in my house without my permission, the right to change everything I've built without asking, the right to tell me I don't belong in my own life, the right to treat me like an inconvenience in my own home. I looked directly at David, this man who had married my granddaughter, and somehow convinced himself that this gave him authority over my life and my property. You have the right to find somewhere else to live. You have the right to build your own life in your own space instead of trying to take over mine. So, Clara was sobbing now, loud and dramatic, the kind of crying designed to attract attention and sympathy. But Grandma, we gave up our apartment. We moved here to take care of you. Where are we supposed to go? How can you just throw us out like we don't matter? I don't know where you're supposed to go, I said, and I meant it. That's not my problem to solve. You made the decision to move in here without really asking if I wanted you here permanently. You assumed that because I'm old, I don't have the right to control my own living situation. You treated my home like it was already yours, just waiting for me to get out of the way. You're making a mistake, David said, his voice cold now. All pretense of concern or affection dropped. You need us more than we need you. What happens when you have another fall? What happens when you can't manage the stairs anymore? What happens when you need help and there's no one here to provide it? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't here out of love or duty or genuine concern for my welfare. He was here because he saw opportunity. He saw an old woman and a valuable house and a path to getting what he wanted without having to work for it, save for it, or earn it honestly. No, I said quietly, with a certainty that came from the very center of my being. I need my dignity more than I need your help. I need my home more than I need your presence. I need my peace more than I need your plans for my life. I need to be treated like a person instead of a problem to be solved. They stood there for another moment, perhaps waiting for me to change my mind, to break down, to become the grateful, compliant old woman they expected me to be, the kind of elderly person who gracefully surrenders all autonomy in exchange for the promise of safety and care. Instead, I walked to Clara's bedroom and began pulling her suitcases from the closet, the ones she'd unpacked with such confidence just months ago when she'd announced her intention to help me. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, as if the sight of me taking action in my own home was the most shocking thing imaginable. "Helping you pack," I said calmly, echoing her own words back to her. "Since you're so good at helping people do things they don't want to do, I thought I'd return the favor." That's when the real argument started, when the polite facades finally cracked completely, and the truth came spilling out like water from a broken dam. Clara screamed about ingratitude and family obligations, about how much they'd sacrificed to move in with me, about how ungrateful I was for their concern and their efforts to improve my life. David threatened to contest my mental competency to call social services to make my life difficult in ways I couldn't imagine. They threw around words like elderly abuse and abandonment and unsafe living conditions, as if my desire to live independently in my own home was evidence of some kind of pathological self-neglect. "You'll regret this," Clara sobbed as I continued to pack their belongings with steady determination. You'll be sorry when you're all alone and something happens and there's no one here to help you. You'll wish you had appreciated us when you had the chance. But I had lived through too much to be intimidated by threats or manipulated by guilt. I had buried a husband I loved more than life itself, raised 3 children alone when he died, survived cancer twice, weathered the deaths of parents and siblings and friends, endured financial hardships and personal losses that would have broken a weaker person. I had learned that some things are worse than being alone, worse than taking risks, worse than facing an uncertain future. Being erased was worse. Being treated like a burden was worse. Living without dignity or respect or the right to make decisions about your own life was worse than any physical danger or practical difficulty. You can call whoever you want, I told them as I continued packing their belongings with methodical efficiency. You can report me to social services, question my mental capacity, or try to have me declared incompetent. But until someone with a badge and a court order tells me otherwise, this is my house and you are not welcome in it. The packing took 3 hours. 3 hours of accusations and tears and threats and promises. They promised to change, to respect my wishes, to treat me better, to include me in decisions about my own life. But promises from people who had already shown me their true feelings seemed worthless as old newspaper, as meaningless as their earlier claims of love and concern. Clara alternated between rage and pleading, between threatening me with abandonment and begging me to reconsider. Grandma, please, we can work this out. We can compromise. We can find a way to make this work for everyone. But I was done compromising. I was done being the only person in the relationship who was expected to be flexible, understanding, and accommodating. I was done sacrificing my preferences, my comfort, and my autonomy for the sake of other people's plans and convenience. The compromise, I said as I folded David's expensive shirts, would have been for you to ask before you moved in permanently. The compromise would have been to include me in decisions about changes to my house. The compromise would have been to treat me like a person whose opinions matter instead of an obstacle to be managed. They left that afternoon, loading their belongings into David's expensive car while neighbors watched from behind curtains. Clara cried the entire time, but they were angry tears now, not sad ones. She kept saying, I would regret this, that I would be sorry when I was alone and needed help, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. You're throwing away your family, she said as she got into the car. You're choosing pride over love, stubbornness over security. When something happens to you, and it will happen, don't expect us to come running back. But as their car disappeared down my street, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. Pure, clean, overwhelming relief, like the feeling of taking off shoes that have been pinching your feet all day, like the sensation of breathing freely after a chest cold finally clears. The house felt different immediately. The air seemed lighter, less charged with tension and unspoken resentment. The rooms felt larger, more welcoming, more like home. I walked through each space, touching things that were exactly where I had left them, breathing in the familiar sense of my own life, the potpourri I'd made from my garden roses, the lemon oil I used on my furniture, the lingering aroma of the coffee I preferred. I made tea in my old kettle instead of the fancy machine Clara had insisted on, savoring the simple ritual of boiling water and steeping leaves. I sat in my mother's rocking chair, back by the window where it belonged, where the light was perfect for reading and I could see my garden and watch the birds at the feeder. I listened to my old radio, the one I had rescued from the trash bag, its familiar static and tinny sound more beautiful than any modern stereo with its digital precision and crystal clarity. The imperfections were part of its charm, part of its history, part of what made it mine. That evening, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been my friend for 30 years, who had watched my children grow up, and had brought casseroles when my husband died, and had shared countless cups of coffee across our adjoining fence. "Helen, are you all right?" she asked immediately, concern evident in her voice. I saw Clara and David leaving with suitcases. It looked like they were upset. "I'm fine," I said, and realized with surprise that I truly meant it. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm free. I told her what had happened, expecting judgment or concern about my ability to live alone, expecting questions about my mental state or my capacity to care for myself. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was warm with approval. "Good for you," she finally said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I was wondering when you were going to stand up to them. That girl had no right to treat you like that in your own home. You noticed?" "Honey, everyone noticed. We all saw how they were changing things, how they treated you like you didn't know your own mind. We just didn't know what to say. It's hard to interfere in family business even when the family is behaving badly." The validation meant more to me than I could express. For months, I'd wondered if I was being overly sensitive, if my discomfort with the changes was just the natural resistance of an old person to new ways of doing things. To learn that others had seen what I'd seen, had recognized the disrespect for what it was, helped me trust my own perceptions and judgments. The next few days were a revelation. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat, simple foods that I enjoyed, prepared the way I liked them, eaten at times that suited my schedule. I arranged furniture the way I preferred it, putting my mother's rocking chair back by the window, returning my plants to spots where they could thrive, restoring the flow and rhythm of my own space. I played my music at the volume I preferred, listened to the radio programs I enjoyed, watched television shows that interested me instead of the modern dramas Clara had insisted were better than my old favorites. I tended my garden without anyone suggesting I hire someone to do it properly, or expressing concern about my ability to handle tools or kneel on the ground. Every simple pleasure felt like a small victory, every autonomous choice like a reclamation of my own identity. I had forgotten how good it felt to live according to my own preferences, to make decisions without having to justify them to people who thought they knew better than I did about my own life. Some neighbors did express concern, though their worry seemed more genuine than Clara's had been. Mrs. Reynolds from down the street stopped by with a casserole and a worried expression. Her kind face creased with the lines of someone who had spent decades caring about other people's welfare. "Helen, dear, are you sure you made the right decision? Clara seemed so devoted to you, so concerned about your well-being." "She was devoted to my house," I corrected gently, inviting Mrs. Reynolds in for coffee and grateful for the company of someone who didn't have an agenda beyond neighborly concern. There's a difference between being devoted to someone and being devoted to what they own. But what if you need help? What if something happens? What if you fall again or have a medical emergency? The questions were familiar, the same ones Clara had used to justify her gradual takeover of my life. But coming from Mrs. Reynolds, they felt different, less like accusations and more like genuine expressions of care from someone who had no ulterior motive. "Then I'll ask for help from people who respect me," I said, pouring coffee into my good china cups, the ones Clara had tried to pack away. "I'll call friends like you, or hire someone professional, or contact one of those senior services agencies. I'll figure it out the way I've been figuring things out for 82 years. Mrs. Reynolds sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her expression softening as she considered my words. "I suppose you're right," she said finally. "I just worry about you being all alone in this big house." "I'm not alone," I said, gesturing toward the windows where I could see other houses, other neighbors, the community I'd been part of for decades. "I'm surrounded by people who care about me without wanting to control me. I'm surrounded by friends who offer help without demanding surrender." She left, looking more convinced than concerned, and I realized that part of my task now would be educating the people around me about the difference between being alone and being lonely, between accepting help and accepting erasure. The weeks that followed settled into a peaceful rhythm. I established new routines, rediscovered old hobbies that I'd abandoned when Clara complained they took up too much space or made too much mess. I pulled out my watercolor paints and set up an easel by the living room window, spending hours capturing the changing light in my garden, the seasonal progression of flowers and leaves and sky. I returned to my sewing room upstairs, climbing those supposedly dangerous stairs multiple times a day without incident, working on a quilt that had been languishing unfinished since Clara had suggested I take up less demanding hobbies appropriate for someone my age. The stairs that had been declared unsafe felt perfectly manageable when I wasn't being constantly reminded of their potential hazards. I joined a book club at the library, a group of women my age and younger who met monthly to discuss novels and memoirs and poetry. For the first time in months, I felt intellectually stimulated, engaged in conversations about ideas and themes and the larger questions that books raise about how to live and what matters and how to find meaning in the midst of difficulty. I started volunteering at the local food bank, sorting donations and packing boxes for families in need. The work was satisfying in a way that Clara's constant improvements to my life had never been. It was useful, necessary, appreciated, and entirely my choice to do. I even took a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never found time for during my busier years. At 82, I was learning new techniques, making new friends, discovering capabilities I didn't know I still possessed. I realized that somewhere along the way I had allowed Clara and David to convince me that being old meant being helpless, that needing some assistance meant surrendering all autonomy, that accepting care required giving up the right to make decisions about my own life. But there was a vast difference between accepting help and accepting erasure, between being cared for and being controlled. I hired a young man from down the street, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, to help with heavy chores like changing light bulbs in high fixtures and moving furniture when I wanted to rearrange rooms. But I hired him on my terms for tasks I defined at times that worked for my schedule. He was respectful, efficient, and grateful for the work, and he never once suggested that needing help with a few physical tasks meant I was incapable of managing my own life. I arranged for grocery delivery when the weather was bad or when I didn't feel like driving, but I continued to make my own choices about what to buy and how much to spend and what meals to prepare. The delivery service was a convenience, not a surrender of independence. I even looked into getting one of those medical alert devices, not because anyone forced me to or because I was afraid, but because it seemed like a reasonable precaution. The difference was choice. Every decision was mine to make. Every change was one I wanted and controlled and understood. The contrast with my months under Clara's care was stark and illuminating. When I chose my own accommodations to aging, they felt empowering rather than diminishing. When I made my own adjustments to physical limitations, they felt practical rather than humiliating. When I accepted help that I had requested rather than help that was imposed on me, it felt like wisdom rather than defeat. About 3 months after Clara left, I received a phone call from my son, Michael, Clara's father, who lived in California with his wife and younger children. His voice was tight with concern and barely contained anger. "Mom, Clara told me what happened. She said you threw her out of the house for no reason, that you're becoming paranoid and hostile. She's worried about your mental state." I had been expecting this call, dreading it, but knowing it was inevitable. Clara would need to justify her actions to the rest of the family, to explain why she was no longer living with her grandmother, to deflect responsibility for what had happened. "Michael," I said calmly, settling into my rocking chair with the phone, "did Clara tell you what she said to me before I asked her to leave?" She said you two had a disagreement about the house, about some changes she was trying to make to help you. She told me I didn't belong in my own home anymore. She said this house wasn't from my time, that I should move to a facility for people my age so she and David could live here." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was different, less accusatory, more thoughtful. "She said that, those exact words, after months of gradually taking over my house, changing everything without asking, treating me like I was mentally incompetent. She finally came out and said what she'd been thinking all along, that I was in the way." Another long pause. "Mom, I had no idea. Clara made it sound like you were being unreasonable about some minor decorating changes." "The changes weren't minor, Michael. She packed away my wedding china, threw out my radio, moved furniture without asking, rearranged my entire kitchen, and made me feel like a stranger in my own home. And when I tried to talk to her about it, she told me I didn't belong here anymore." I could hear Michael sigh, a sound heavy with disappointment and recognition. "That doesn't sound like trying to help someone. That sounds like something else entirely." It was something else entirely. It was waiting for me to die so she could have my house without the inconvenience of my continued existence. "Mom, I'm so sorry. If I had known what was really happening, I would have said something. Clara painted such a different picture. She made it sound like she was sacrificing to take care of you, like you were being difficult and ungrateful." The validation from my son meant everything to me. For months I had questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was being too sensitive or too stubborn or too resistant to change. To have Michael understand what had really happened, to have him recognize the difference between help and control, restored some of my faith in family relationships. "How are you managing on your own?" he asked. "Are you really okay there by yourself?" "I'm more than okay," I said, and I could hear the strength in my own voice. "I'm happy. I'm living my own life, making my own choices, taking care of myself the way I always have. I have help when I need it, friends who care about me, activities that give me purpose. I'm not just surviving, Michael. I'm thriving." "Good," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I was worried that Clara might be right, that you might be taking unnecessary risks or being too proud to accept help." "I'm not too proud to accept help," I said. "I'm too proud to accept erasure. There's a difference." We talked for another hour, the longest conversation Michael and I had had in years. He told me about his work, his children's activities, his wife's garden that reminded him of mine. I told him about my painting class, my volunteer work, my rediscovered joy in simple daily routines. For the first time in months, I felt truly connected to my family, not as a burden or a problem to be managed, but as a person with interests and opinions and a life worth sharing. About a month later, I received another call. This one from my daughter Susan in Florida. She was crying before she even said hello. "Mom, I just talked to Michael. I can't believe what Clara did to you. I am so ashamed that my niece treated you that way." Susan had always been my most emotionally expressive child, the one who felt things deeply and wasn't afraid to show it. Her outrage on my behalf was fierce and protective in a way that warmed my heart. I should have visited more, she continued through her tears. I should have checked on what was really happening. I just assumed Clara was taking good care of you, that you were happy to have family nearby. You couldn't have known, I reassured her. Clara was very careful to present herself as the devoted granddaughter, making sacrifices to care for her aging grandmother. She's good at managing appearances, but I should have listened to my instincts. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I ignored it because it seemed so convenient, so perfect. Clara gets to live in a beautiful house. You get care and companionship. It seemed like everybody won, except I didn't win, I said. I lost my autonomy, my dignity, and my right to exist comfortably in my own space. The only thing I gained was the knowledge that I was still capable of standing up for myself when it really mattered. Susan was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than emotional. Mom, would you like me to come visit? Not to check up on you or to take care of you, but just to spend time together. I could stay in a hotel, or if you want company in the house, I could sleep in the guest room, whatever you prefer. The offer moved me to tears. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of gratitude for being treated like a person capable of making decisions about my own hospitality, my own comfort, my own preferences. I would love that, I said. And yes, please stay in the guest room. I'd enjoy the company, and I'd like to show you my painting and my garden and introduce you to some of my new friends. Susan came for a week in late summer, and it was one of the most healing experiences I'd had in years. She admired the changes I'd made to restore my home to my own preferences, praised my artwork, helped me with some minor household projects that were easier with two people, and generally treated me like a competent adult whose life had value and interest. We talked about Clara, about the difference between helping and controlling, about the challenges of aging with dignity in a culture that often views older people as burdens rather than resources. Susan shared her own experiences with feeling dismissed or patronized as a middle-aged woman, her struggles with being taken seriously in her professional life. It's like there's this assumption, she said as we sat in my garden one evening, that past a certain age, women especially become invisible, irrelevant, incapable of making good decisions about their own lives. People start treating you like a child who needs to be managed instead of an adult who might need some assistance. Exactly, I said, grateful to have my experience understood so clearly. Clara never saw me as someone who might need help with specific tasks while remaining fully capable of managing my own life. She saw me as someone whose time had passed, whose preferences didn't matter, whose autonomy was a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected. We also talked about my future, about practical considerations for continued independent living, about what kinds of support I might need as I aged further. But these were conversations between equals, discussions where my preferences and opinions carried weight, planning sessions where I was the primary decision maker rather than a problem to be managed. Susan helped me research services available in my area, meal delivery programs, transportation options for seniors, home maintenance services, medical alert systems. But she presented them as options for me to consider rather than necessities I needed to accept, and she respected my right to choose which services I wanted and which I preferred to handle myself. The goal, she said, should be to help you live the life you want to live, not to impose someone else's vision of what your life should look like. It was such a simple concept, but it felt revolutionary after months of having my preferences dismissed and my choices overruled by people who claimed to know better than I did about my own needs and desires. The visit also gave me perspective on how much I had changed, how much stronger and more confident I had become since reclaiming my independence. When Susan first arrived, I worried that I might seem diminished to her, that living alone might have made me smaller or lonelier or less capable. Instead, she commented repeatedly on how vibrant I seemed, how engaged with life, how clearly happy in my own space. "You seem more like yourself than you have in years," she said. "More confident, more settled, more present, I guess. When I talked to you while Clara was here, you always seemed distracted or worried or like you were walking on eggshells." I had been walking on eggshells, I realized. I had been constantly monitoring my own behavior, trying to avoid giving Clara reasons to criticize or correct me, attempting to be the kind of grateful, compliant, elderly person she seemed to expect me to be. The effort had been exhausting and had indeed made me smaller, less decisive, less confident in my own judgment. About 6 months after Clara left, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was hers, but the handwriting was different, smaller, more careful, less confident than the bold scrawl I remembered from birthday cards and thank you notes. I made a cup of tea before opening it, settling into my rocking chair by the window where the afternoon light was perfect for reading. The envelope was thin, containing only a single sheet of paper, and I could feel my heart rate increasing as I prepared to read whatever Clara had decided to say. "Dear Grandma," it began, and I could already feel the difference in tone, the absence of the patronizing sweetness that had characterized so many of our conversations. "I've been thinking about what happened between us, and I need to say some things that I should have said a long time ago. I was wrong, not just about the house or the furniture or the changes I made, but about everything. About the way I treated you, about the assumptions I made, about the person I became when I was living in your house. I convinced myself that I was helping you, but I was really helping myself. I saw your house and your independence as problems to be solved, rather than as things to be respected. I treated you like you were broken instead of just different from me, like you were a burden instead of a person with rights and preferences and the capacity to make decisions about your own life. David and I found an apartment across town. It's small and expensive and nothing like your beautiful house, but it's forcing us to build our own life instead of trying to take over yours. The experience has been educational. Living in a cramped space, paying high rent, dealing with noisy neighbors, and maintenance issues we can't control has given me some perspective on what we were asking you to give up. More than that, though, I've had time to think about the person I became while we were living with you. I don't recognize that person now. The woman who packed away your wedding china without asking, who threw out your radio without checking if it worked for you, who moved your mother's rocking chair because I thought I knew better than you did about your own preferences. That wasn't the granddaughter you raised. That wasn't the person I thought I was. I realize now that when I said you didn't belong in your house anymore, what I really meant was that I wanted your house more than I wanted to respect your life. I wanted your space and your things and your place in the world, but I didn't want the responsibility of treating you like the independent, capable person you've always been. I wanted the convenience of living in your beautiful house without the inconvenience of acknowledging that it was your house, that you had rights and preferences and opinions about how it should be maintained and arranged and lived in. I wanted to play house in your space without having to treat you as anything more than an inconvenient obstacle to my vision of how things should be. The worst part is that I genuinely convinced myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself that all the changes I made were for your own good, that I was helping you live more safely and efficiently and modernly. I told myself that your resistance to my improvements was just stubbornness or confusion or the natural difficulty older people have with change. But I was lying to myself. The changes I made weren't about your safety or comfort. They were about my preferences. I moved things to places that worked better for me. I threw away items that annoyed me. I rearranged furniture to create the kind of space I wanted to live in. I was renovating your house according to my taste and then telling myself it was for your benefit. Even worse, I think part of me was already planning for your death. Not consciously, not maliciously, but somewhere in the back of my mind. I was preparing the house for the day when it would be mine. I was making changes that would be convenient for me as the eventual owner, arranging things according to my future plans rather than your current needs. That's probably the most shameful thing I have to admit, that I was treating you like a temporary occupant in your own home, like someone who was just keeping the place warm until the real owners, David and me, could take over properly. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. The way I treated you was inexcusable, not just because of what I did, but because of how I justified it to myself and others. I made you feel like a stranger in your own home, like your preferences didn't matter, like your continued existence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a life to be respected. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did wrong. It wasn't the house that was out of time, it was my heart that didn't know how to respect yours. It wasn't your preferences that were outdated, it was my assumption that my youth gave me the right to override your experience and wisdom. I love you, Grandma. I always have. But love without respect isn't really love at all, is it? It's just another form of selfishness dressed up in pretty words and good intentions. Real love would have meant listening to you, including you in decisions about your own life, respecting your right to live according to your own values and preferences. Real love would have meant offering help without demanding control, providing assistance without requiring surrender, caring for you without erasing you. If you ever want to see me again, I promise to come as your granddaughter, not as someone who thinks she knows better than you about your own life. I promise to visit your house as a guest, not as someone with a hidden agenda or ulterior motives. I promise to respect your choices even when I don't understand them, to ask before I change anything, to remember that your house is your house and your life is your life. But I understand if you don't want that. I understand if I've damaged something that can't be repaired, if trust once broken can't be rebuilt, if some wounds are too deep to heal. I understand if you're happier without me in your life than you were with me trying to control it. I hope you're happy in your house, surrounded by your things, living your life the way you choose to live it. I hope you're painting and gardening and volunteering and doing all the things that bring you joy. I hope you're surrounded by people who see you for who you are rather than who they think you should be. I hope someday I can be one of those people again. With love and regret, Clara P.S. I found your radio in a box in our storage unit. David had saved it, thinking it might be worth something someday. I know now that its value was never about money. It was about being yours, about being chosen by you, about being part of your daily ritual and comfort. I'll bring it when I come to visit, if you ever want me to visit. If not, I'll find a way to get it back to you anyway. It belongs in your house, with you. I read the letter 3 times, feeling a complex mixture of emotions with each reading. Relief that she understood what she had done wrong, that her apology was specific and complete rather than generic and self-serving. Sadness for the months of tension and pain we had both endured, for the damage that had been done to our relationship, for the trust that had been broken, hope that maybe, someday, we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of assumed authority. Gratitude that she had taken the time to reflect honestly on her behavior, to acknowledge the harm she had caused, to take responsibility without making excuses or shifting blame, but also wariness. Words were easy. Changed behavior was harder. Apologies were common. Genuine transformation was rare. I had learned not to trust promises from people who had already shown me their true character under pressure. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with my important papers, next to my insurance policies and my will and the deed to my house. Maybe someday I would write back. Maybe someday Clara would visit and we would drink tea together in my rocking chair by the window and talk about books or weather or anything except who belonged where and who had the right to make decisions about whose life, or maybe not. Maybe some relationships couldn't be repaired, only learned from. Maybe some trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt. Maybe some boundaries, once violated, created permanent distance. Either way, I was at peace with my decision. I had chosen dignity over convenience, respect over assistance, autonomy over security. I had chosen to belong to myself first, in my own space, on my own terms. A year later, I was in my garden on a warm spring morning, transplanting seedlings I had started on my kitchen windowsill when Mrs. Patterson called over the fence. "Helen, you have a visitor." I looked up, dirt under my fingernails and sun on my face, to see a young woman standing hesitantly by my front gate. For a moment I didn't recognize her. Then I realized it was Clara, but she looked different, smaller somehow, less certain, less entitled to space and attention and deference. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and wearing an expression I had never seen before, genuine humility mixed with hope and uncertainty. In her other hand, she carried a small box that I recognized immediately. My old radio, the one I had rescued from her trash bag, the one that had been my companion through so many quiet evenings. "Hello, Grandma," she said quietly, her voice uncertain, in a way that was completely foreign to the confident young woman who had once told me I didn't belong in my own home. I was wondering, could I visit with you for a little while? Just to talk. I brought your radio back. I hoped you might want it. I stood there in my garden, completely in charge of my own life and my own choices, surrounded by plants I had chosen and arranged according to my own preferences, living according to my own schedule and priorities and values. I could say yes or no, and either answer would be the right one because it would be mine to make. I looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't seen before. Not just youth and confidence and the assumption that she knew better than everyone else about how life should be lived. I saw uncertainty, humility, and what appeared to be genuine remorse. I saw someone who had learned something difficult about herself, who had been forced to confront the gap between her intentions and her actions, who had discovered that good intentions don't excuse harmful behavior. "Yes," I said finally, brushing the dirt from my hands and standing up slowly from my kneeling position among the flower beds. "You can visit, but we're going to sit on the porch and drink iced tea, and you're going to tell me about your new apartment and your new life, and I'm going to tell you about my painting class and my book club and my volunteer work, and neither of us is going to try to fix the other one." Clara smiled, and for the first time in years, it looked genuine rather than patronizing, hopeful rather than calculated. "That sounds perfect, Grandma. That sounds like exactly what I was hoping for." As she walked up the path to my front door, the same path she had walked with such confidence and hidden agenda just over a year ago, I realized something important. I had not just saved my house or my independence or my right to make decisions about my own life. I had saved the possibility of a real relationship with my granddaughter, one based on equality and respect rather than assumed hierarchy and manufactured need. I had created the space for genuine love to exist, the kind that honors rather than erases, that supports rather than controls, that cares for someone by allowing them to remain themselves. As we settled onto the porch with our iced tea and Clara carefully placed my old radio on the table between us, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal victory. I had not just stood up for myself, I had stood up for the principle that every person, regardless of age or circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I had proven that love without respect isn't love at all, that care without autonomy isn't care but control, that helping someone doesn't require erasing them. I had demonstrated that it's possible to age with grace and strength, to accept assistance without surrendering authority, to need help with some things while remaining fully capable of managing your own life. Today, I am a woman who belongs exactly where she is, in my house, surrounded by my memories and my choices, and my own version of what makes life worth living. I belong to my own story, my own truth, my own understanding of what it means to live with dignity and purpose and the freedom to make decisions about my own existence. And if Clara wants to be part of that story going forward, she is welcome, as long as she comes as my granddaughter, not as my judge, jury, or self-appointed caretaker. As long as she understands that my house is my house, my life is my life, and my choices are my choices to make. The door is open, but the terms are mine. And that, I've learned, makes all the difference in the world. It makes the difference between existing and living, between surviving and thriving, between being cared for and being respected. It makes the difference between belonging to other people's plans for your life and belonging to yourself.